Hello friends, my name is JJ, and with just a few weeks to go before the big, exciting US election, I just thought I should say a few words about democracy. Political democracy, which is to say the system of letting the people pick their own leaders, is super important. It is the fairest, most honest, and responsible system of government that man has yet devised, and embracing democratic government has made this continental civilization of ours as successful as it has been. But that said, democracy is not perfect. In fact, it is precisely because democracy is such a fair and tolerant system that it is also very fragile and easily exploited. Today, I want to talk about some of the ways that the logic of democracy can be used to damage democracy. The way that voters, in particular, can use their powers in various undemocratic ways to weaken or ruin the very system that places so much trust in their wisdom. In short, the paradoxes of democracy. We will look at 6 different democratic paradoxes, and after each one, I will give you my opinion as to whether the threat posed by this paradox is low, medium, or high in regards to the present state of democracy in the Western world. Got it? Let's get started. Okay, so the first democratic paradox is one that is said to have personally disturbed the logician Kurt Gödel quite a bit, and that is constitutional amendments. For a democratic system of government to work, it has to have some sort of constitution spelling out its rules, and for that government to be a true democracy, there has to be some democratic way to change the Constitution. Because otherwise, you're just forever living under the tyranny of whoever wrote the Constitution. And so, all democratic countries have some sort of procedure where the legislature or the public can vote to make changes to the Constitution when they feel it is appropriate. The problem, however, is there is nothing to stop you from amending a democratic constitution to make it undemocratic. You could pass a constitutional amendment that says all elections are hereby suspended forever, or that all lawmaking power will henceforth be concentrated in the hands of a hereditary dictator for life. Or you could just pass an amendment saying that the Constitution itself is hereby abolished and we are now officially in a state of lawless anarchy. This is sometimes described as the legalistic way to kill democracies, and it has historically been a common tactic of sabotage in emerging democratic states that are under the sway of a single domineering politician. As that politician seeks to dominate the country further, he proposes all sorts of crazy constitutional amendments to increase his personal power, and his proposals are dutifully approved by a compliant parliament or rigged public referendums. This is very much what happened to democratic Russia. Putin was a powerful Russian politician, and he passed a bunch of constitutional amendments that soon made him the only powerful Russian politician. This sort of thing doesn't really happen in well-established democracies, however, with strong political parties and free speech and a free press and all of that. And this is just because in more mature democracies, the amount of approval that you need to pass constitutional amendments is generally quite high, and it's generally quite difficult to get a high level of public consensus in favor of dramatic political reform in a free society. And so for that reason, I'm going to rank this one as low in terms of democratic danger. If anything, I think that far more democracies these days suffer from the fact that it is incredibly difficult to pass even the most mild, common sense constitutional amendments that might actually help strengthen democracy. All right, democratic paradox number 2 is Lindsey Graham syndrome. This is a concept I learned about from a very good podcast called The Corruption of Lindsey Graham, put out by my pals at The Bulwark. Basically, the story here is that there is a famous Republican senator in the US named Lindsey Graham. I'm sure you've heard of him. And he ran for president against Donald Trump in 2016. And just to summarize the situation in very generic terms, Senator Graham said that Donald Trump was a terrible man who would be a truly horrible president.
I'm not going to try to get into the mind of Donald Trump because I don't think there's a whole lot of space there. I think he's a kook. I think he's crazy. I think he's unfit for office.
But then Donald Trump was elected president anyway. And in the aftermath of that, Lindsey Graham completely changed his perspective. He started saying that Trump was actually a great man who would be a great president, and Graham would do everything in his power as a US senator to help him implement his agenda. That is still Lindsey Graham's position to this day. Now, it is very easy to be cynical about why Lindsey Graham made this pivot, but according to Senator Graham himself, he did it because he was deferring to democracy. Trump was elected, and under the principles of democracy, anyone who wins an election is morally in the right.
He is President of the United States. He beat me like a drum, and I want to help him where I can because there's a lot on this man's plate, and we should all want to help him.
What have you learned about him that makes him different and more someone you want to work with and can work with than he was when you said he was unfit for office and quite possibly a kook?
Yeah, I said everything. I said he was a xenophobic, race-baiting, religious bigot. I ran out of adjectives. Well, the American people spoke. They rejected my analysis, and he is now my president.
Respecting our democratic system means recognizing the validity of whatever leader that system produces, and respecting their right to pursue whatever agenda they want. And if you work for the government, this might entail having to go along with an agenda you previously considered wrong, but has now been endorsed by the people, meaning it would now be undemocratic to oppose. And so Lindsey Graham fell in line, believing his previous critiques of Trump were wrong because the public had rejected them, and that Trump was now a good guy because he had received the democratic endorsement of the public. All democracies have the capacity to elect bad leaders, but when we admit this, it does kind of undermine the logic of the system a bit. A big part of the reason why democracy is supposed to be better than other political systems, after all, is because the collective wisdom of voters is supposed to help screen out the truly bad candidates. And it's for that reason that democratic societies often struggle with the question of how much a bad leader who was legitimately elected can be opposed before it crosses the line into undermining the whole democratic system. No one wants to become Egypt, where in 2013 their democratically elected leader was overthrown in a military coup, supposedly because he posed a threat to democracy. But once you start using brazenly undemocratic means to save democracy, the whole situation has become completely morally incoherent. Of course, most democratic systems deal with this paradox by just not consolidating too much unilateral power in the hands of a single leader. Most mature democratic systems have a separately elected chamber of the legislature and independently appointed courts that enjoy equal democratic right to exercise checks and balances on the elected leader. Or, in other words, other parts of the government are explicitly given their own democratic mandate to keep an eye on the leader and question or reject some of his decisions if they think they are bad. And of course, most democratic systems also have some sort of mechanism allowing a bad leader to be peacefully expelled from office if he misbehaves too much. I would still rank this threat to democracy as medium, however, just because I think democratic culture has a pretty deeply ingrained bias towards giving a leader who wins an election a lot of trust and deference, even when a lot of people know full well he is going to be a disaster. I mean, even Hillary Clinton was briefly prepared to defer to Trump.
Donald Trump is going to be our president. We owe him an open mind and the chance to lead.
Paradox number 3 is a very old criticism of democracy that is now often associated with the 18th century Scottish intellectual Lord Wodehouse-Lee, namely, voting yourself money. Governments have access to a lot of money to fund the services they provide, which they get from taxes and tariffs and service fees and loans and other stuff. But in theory, there is nothing to prevent a democracy from just turning into an ATM for the voters. And by this, I don't mean just voting to raise taxes on other people in order to raise funds for programs that you personally benefit from or whatever. I mean literally just voting for politicians who are like, I will cut you a check for $1 million from the government treasury if you vote for me. And then the $1 million checks for everyone party comes to power and passes the $1 million checks for everyone act. This sort of plundering would obviously cause a government to collapse into bankruptcy in short order, which was Lord Wodehouse-Lee's whole point. He believed that the public had a certain greed that would inevitably set in, and once that greed took over, democracy would collapse. Democracy can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves largesse from the public treasury, was how he put it in a famous quote that he might have never actually said. I'm gonna rate this particular threat as low at the moment, just because for all of the fiscal irresponsibility that democracies are in the world suffer from these days, we are thankfully not yet quite so cynical as to believe that government can or should function as our private piggy bank. Although we should all keep an eye on the UBI people. On a similar note, we have paradox number 4, the tyranny of the majority. Another very old critique of democracy. Tyranny of the majority is the simple mathematical equation that states if democratic decisions are decided by majority preference, then there is nothing to stop a majority of voters from consistently making decisions that impose cruelty and oppression upon the minority of voters. The classic joke is that democracy is a wolf and a fox voting with a chicken to decide who's for dinner. A more real-world example would be the southern United States during the segregation times. The region's white majority didn't like the black minority, so they voted for politicians who made life harder for black people, keeping them in segregated schools and making it illegal for them to marry outside of their race and all the rest of it. They even passed laws making it harder for them to vote, thereby stripping them of whatever little political power they had. And at the time, this was justified as being perfectly fair, according to the principles of democracy. The majority had its preference, and the minority had no right to complain because, you know, majority rules. These days, however, we understand that majorities can unleash horrendous human rights abuses upon minorities unless there are laws in place that explicitly recognize the equal worth of all citizens under the law, even when that means overriding the will of the majority. Another US example would be how in the 2000s, many states passed referendums denying gay people the right to marry each other, only for those referendums to then get overturned by the US Supreme Court on the grounds that the straight majority did not have a right to oppress the gay minority in this way. Even though all democracies basically now have civil rights laws to prevent legal discrimination against unpopular minorities, I would still say that this is a medium-level threat, just because the process of agreeing to recognize the rights of minorities, and especially new minorities, can often be quite slow, and is often only ever sorted out after a period of oppression at the hands of the voting majority. Paradox number 5. Voting based on vibes. So the whole principle of democratic government is that the people rule. But baked into that principle is an implicit assumption that the people take their duties as rulers seriously. If the people decide to stop caring, however, and no longer treat their duty to vote with the kind of seriousness and maturity it requires, then a democracy has in some important way basically stopped being a democracy. It has become a shell of a democracy, a simulacrum of a democracy. Like, it would be entirely possible for voters to just decide that from now on we are going to treat elections as beauty pageants and just vote for whoever is the prettiest candidate, or whoever is the richest, or whoever won the most Grammys for Best Recording Artist. This kind of unserious approach to democracy is what is depicted as one of the problems plaguing the failing America that is seen in the endlessly cited movie Idiocracy, where the brain-dead citizens of the future have elected some equally moronic pro-wrestler porn star to be president. But you can also see this affecting real-world democracies all over the place today, where a lot of voters evaluate the fitness of a candidate for office based on superficial things like how they make them feel or what their vibes are like, as opposed to their qualifications for office or the practicality of their policy proposals. So I'm going to rank this danger as high, because I think a failure to take democracy as seriously as we should is one of the biggest dangers to good government facing the democratic world right now. I mean, we all lead very busy lives, and as government has become more complicated, having informed opinions on what government should or shouldn't be doing inevitably demands a lot more effort from us, and a lot of us just can't be bothered to give voting that level of effort. So instead, we lapse into treating democracy as an opportunity for little more than cultural self-expression, or even entertainment. Which brings us to the final paradox of democracy: lying. Now this one might seem a little underwhelming, because obviously the idea of a politician lying his way into office is a super common cliche. But when we speak of a politician lying in the traditional sense, we're usually speaking of them being, a little vague in describing what they're going to do, or a little weaselly in their choice of words, saying something like, "I have no current plans to raise taxes," or "I don't anticipate having to make any budget cuts," when they know full well that they're going to have to do those things, but also want a bit of short-term plausible deniability. A much bigger challenge to the democratic system would be a politician who lies more spectacularly about a broader range of things than just his policy agenda. After all, you can punish a politician who doesn't keep his promises, but a politician who lies more aggressively about basic facts of the world can manipulate the democratic system in some really destructive and novel ways. For example, in theory, there's not much stopping a politician from spreading horrible slander about his political opponent, calling them a murderer or a pedophile or something equally vile, nor is there much stopping a politician from making up stories about some horrible, deadly threat to society and then saying that voting for him is the only thing you can do to stop those bad things from happening. Obviously, at some level, your willingness to believe these sorts of lies depends on how personally persuasive you find that politician, and how willing you are to accept the things that he says with no evidence or fake evidence. In a free society, open debate and a free press helps us publicly adjudicate the truthfulness of things that a politician says, and this in turn helps inoculate us to some degree against the most spectacular sort of lies. But historically, we've also been protected from some of the most egregious and aggressive sort of political lies, simply because most politicians have historically also possessed some level of personal dignity that prevents them from lying too outrageously. The truly dangerous combination is therefore a politician who is persuasive to the point where people will easily believe his lies, but also shameless and cynical enough to be prepared to lie openly to win votes. I am going to controversially rank this risk as medium, not necessarily because I have a lot of faith in politicians' ability to resist an incentive structure that makes lying a great competitive advantage, but just because I think that most humans are programmed with an aversion to being completely dishonest in public, even politicians. The truly shameless liar is pretty rare in politics, just because I don't think that people who behave that way generally get that far in life. On the voter side, meanwhile, we are obviously inclined to believe things that we want to be true with very little evidence, and that is certainly a problem, but it's also a very different problem than saying we all have the same innate capacity to be bamboozled by any random sociopath who comes along. Most of us do have pretty good BS detectors, which I suppose is one good thing about growing up in a cynical age. So there you go, 6 paradoxes that, if left untreated, can wreak havoc on the healthy body that is democratic self-government. These are the 6 that have always captured my attention, but I know that democratic paradoxes are also something that have captured the attention of political philosophers for a very long time. Like I said at the start, I believe very strongly in the importance of upholding democracy, but part of that also means that you always have to have your eyes open to the ways that democracy can be twisted to destroy itself. So if you guys have any other good examples that you think are worth noting, let me know in the comments, and until then, I will see you next week.